The neon sign of the diner cast a warm, familiar glow over Logan's calloused hands as he wiped down the counter, finding comfort in the quiet routine of his simple life. But the screen of the second phone his wife had accidentally left in her coat pocket was lit up with a reality that didn't belong to him. A message confirming a diamond ring and a text calling her, "My beautiful fiancé." A chilling realization settled over him in the silent apartment. The woman he had been devotedly married to for 5 years was about to marry a wealthy stranger. If the fragile, hidden fractures of love and betrayal draw you in, stay with me. There are many more layers to uncover beneath the surface of this quiet storm, so don't leave the channel just yet. The rhythmic hiss of the deep fryer and the smell of stale coffee clung to Logan Hayes like a second skin. It was 3 in the morning in New Jersey. The diner was finally empty, the neon "open" sign buzzing relentlessly outside the grease-stained window, casting long, fractured shadows across the black and white checkered floor. Logan wiped down the stainless steel prep counter for the 4th time. He was a man of simple routines, a line cook who found a strange comfort in the predictable cadence of flipping burgers and scrubbing griddles. His hands were rough, deeply calloused from years of honest labor, but his mind was anchored to a quiet apartment 5 miles away, where his wife, Catherine, was supposed to be sleeping. Catherine. Just her name felt like a fine silk thread woven into the rough burlap of his existence. She managed a high-end cosmetics counter at a luxury department store in the city. Lately, she smelled of perfumes Logan could never afford to pronounce, coming home later and later with vague, exhausted stories of inventory checks and demanding regional managers. He had believed her. He had loved her with the kind of blind, unwavering faith only a man who had nothing else to lose could muster. When Logan finally pushed open the door to their cramped, one-bedroom apartment, the silence inside was thick, almost suffocating. The amber glow from the street lamp outside bled through the cheap horizontal blinds, striping the living room floor in bands of light and dark. Catherine's expensive trench coat, a purchase she claimed she had saved 6 months for, was carelessly draped over the back of a dining chair, one sleeve slipping toward the floor. Logan sighed softly, his heavy work boots making no sound as he crossed the worn carpet. He reached out to lift the coat, intending to hang it properly. As the heavy fabric shifted, something hard slipped from the deep interior pocket and hit the linoleum floor with a sharp clack. A phone. Not her usual phone with the cracked screen protector that he had offered to fix, but a sleek, brand-new model in a pristine rose gold case. Logan froze. The device lay face up, the screen suddenly illuminating the dark kitchen with a glaring, blue-white light. A notification had just pushed through the lock screen. Logan didn't want to look. Every instinct, forged by years of quiet dignity, told him to put it back on the table and walk away. But the text floating on the glass was impossible to ignore. "Julian, the caterer, confirmed the lobster for the reception, darling. Can't wait to call you my wife. Good night, my beautiful fiancé." The low hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed to roar in Logan's ears. The air in the room instantly grew thin, refusing to fill his lungs. He stared at the glowing letters until they blurred, his heart executing a slow, agonizing drop into his stomach. "Fiancé." The word felt entirely foreign, sharp as a razor blade against his throat. He turned his head slowly toward the slightly ajar bedroom door. He could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of Catherine breathing in the dark. The woman who had sworn to love him 5 years ago in a dimly lit municipal courthouse. His calloused thumb hovered over the glowing screen. With a sickening feeling of trespassing in his own life, he swiped up. There was no passcode. The screen opened directly to a gallery of photos. Catherine, radiant in a silk evening gown, laughing on the deck of a yacht. Catherine, holding up a massive diamond ring that caught the sunlight. Catherine, kissing a man with graying temples and an immaculate, custom-tailored suit. A perfectly curated, entirely different existence. She wasn't just having a cheap, fleeting affair. She was auditioning for a different tax bracket, erasing Logan completely from her narrative. Logan didn't yell. He didn't storm into the bedroom, tear off the covers, and demand answers. Instead, a profound, chilling calmness washed over his tired bones. The anger was there, buried deep in his chest, but it was entirely overshadowed by a crushing, absolute sorrow. He set the phone gently back on the table, exactly where it had fallen. He looked at his own reflection in the dark kitchen window, a tired man in a diner uniform smelling of grease, standing perfectly still in the ruins of a marriage that had secretly ended months ago. The silence of the apartment was no longer peaceful. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a grave. Logan's calloused hand hovered over the rose-gold phone for what felt like hours. The digital clock on the microwave shifted to 4:12 a.m., casting a faint green hue across the scratched Formica counter. He picked the device up again. The initial shock had receded, leaving behind a cold, clinical numbness that terrified him. He was a man who understood how things were built, how to break down a side of beef, how to repair the diner's industrial dishwasher when the belts snapped. Now, he needed to understand how his wife had dismantled their reality without making a single sound. He bypassed the photo gallery and opened the email application. The inbox was a meticulously organized archive of a life that did not belong to him. There were threads detailing floral arrangements for a country club in Connecticut, PDF attachments of a custom wedding menu featuring truffles and caviar, and a confirmation for a luxury honeymoon in the Maldives. Every email was addressed to Catherine Whitmore, unattached and refined. Then, he found the lease agreement. It was a digital copy for a penthouse apartment in Tribeca, signed by Julian, with Catherine listed as a co-occupant. The move-in date was set for exactly 3 weeks from today. Logan stared at the glowing document. He imagined Catherine sitting on the edge of their sagging mattress, complaining about the cost of groceries, while secretly coordinating the delivery of Italian leather furniture to a Manhattan zip code. The sheer, staggering logistics of her deception anchored him to the kitchen chair. He wondered how she had managed the transitions. How did she scrub the scent of expensive Cabernet and high-end steakhouses from her breath before crawling under their cheap polyester duvet? How did she look into his eyes and accept his hard-earned paycheck for the rent, knowing she was weeks away from stepping onto a yacht? He set the phone down and turned it off, erasing the blue light from the room. He did not cry. The betrayal was too vast, too absolute for something as simple as tears. It felt as though someone had reached into his chest and quietly removed his lungs. By 6 a.m., the sky outside turned the color of wet concrete. The rain began to fall, tapping softly against the thin glass of the kitchen window. Logan stood up, his joints aching from the damp air. Out of pure, mechanical habit, he started the coffee maker, listening to it sputter and hiss, the soundtrack of their 5 years together. The bedroom door creaked open. Catherine shuffled into the narrow hallway, rubbing her eyes. She was wearing one of his faded flannel shirts, the hem brushing her bare thighs. Her hair was tousled, her face scrubbed clean, of the expensive cosmetics she sold to wealthy women during the day. She looked exactly like the woman he had married. The camouflage was flawless. "Morning," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She padded barefoot across the linoleum, leaning against the counter beside him. She reached out, her delicate fingers lightly brushing his forearm. "You're up early, or did you just get back?" Logan looked down at her hand, resting on his arm. He felt the warmth of her skin, a sensation that had grounded him for half a decade. Now, it felt like touching a ghost. He slowly met her gaze. Her eyes held the perfect, manufactured warmth of a loving wife, concerned for her overworked husband. "Just couldn't sleep," Logan said. His voice was remarkably steady, betraying nothing of the wasteland expanding inside him. Catherine smiled sympathetically, turning to grab a mug from the cabinet. "You work too hard, Logan. We'll have a quiet weekend, just us, I promise." In that suspended moment, watching her pour the cheap coffee, Logan made his choice. A lesser man would have shattered the mug against the wall. A louder man would have dragged the rose-gold phone into the light and demanded a confession. But Logan realized with chilling clarity that there was nothing left to salvage, and no apology could bridge the chasm she had quietly dug between them. He would not scream. He would not fight for a woman who did not exist. The click of the front door latch was the loudest sound Logan had ever heard. He stood motionless by the kitchen sink, listening to the rhythmic, confident clack of Catherine's heels fading down the linoleum hallway of their apartment building. She had kissed his cheek just moments before, a fleeting brush of expensive lipstick that smelled of roses and deceit. "Have a good day sleeping, honey," she had murmured, adjusting the lapel of her designer trench coat before stepping out into the morning rain. Logan waited until the distant, mechanical groan of the elevator signaled she was truly gone. Then, he finally exhaled. He didn't grab a trash bag in a sudden fit of fiery rage. He didn't shatter the framed photograph of their municipal courthouse wedding that sat on the nightstand. Instead, he walked slowly to the hallway closet and pulled down a faded canvas duffel bag. It was old, bought from a military surplus store long before he ever knew Catherine's name. It would be enough. He packed with the brutal, mechanical efficiency of a man who suddenly realized how little of his own life actually belonged to him. 4 pairs of worn jeans, 3 plain cotton shirts, his heavy, grease-stained diner uniforms. He left behind the expensive stainless steel watch Catherine had bought him for their 3rd anniversary. A gift he now sickeningly suspected was funded by the very real estate developer who was replacing him. He folded his clothes neatly, pressing the air out of the fabric, feeling a hollow ache expanding in his chest with every item he packed away. The apartment felt increasingly foreign with every trace of himself he removed. Logan walked into the bathroom and gathered his razor and cheap shaving cream. He stopped to look at the dual vanity they shared. Her side was a chaotic landscape of heavy glass bottles, French moisturizers, and delicate gold jewelry resting in velvet trays. His side was just a narrow sliver of space at the edge of the porcelain sink. He took a damp towel and slowly wiped his side down, erasing the water spots, erasing the faint dusting of shaving powder. He was erasing himself. Returning to the living room, Logan retrieved the vacuum and the cleaning supplies. For the next 2 hours, he cleaned. He scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed, polished the scuffed coffee table, and washed the lone mug he had used that morning. It was a bizarre, almost monastic ritual of grief. He wanted to leave the space exactly as he had found it 5 years ago. Empty, quiet, and holding no evidence of his existence. He refused to leave a mess for her to clean up. He refused to give her a single reason to view him as a burden or a chaotic mistake. By noon, the apartment was immaculate. The rain had stopped, and pale sunlight broke through the gray clouds, casting long, dusty rays across the vacuumed living room carpet. Logan stood by the kitchen island, his duffel bag resting heavily against his work boots. He slowly raised his left hand. The simple gold band felt incredibly heavy, gripping his skin tighter than he remembered. It took a firm, deliberate twist to slide it over his knuckle. The skin underneath was pale and tender, a distinct physical indentation marking a promise he had kept and she had effortlessly broken. Logan placed the ring in the dead center of the kitchen counter. It made a sharp, definitive click against the formica. Next to it, he placed his brass apartment key. No angry note. No final, desperate letter. No explanation. The silence of the empty apartment would be much louder than any words he could possibly write. Logan hoisted the heavy duffel bag over his broad shoulder. He didn't look back as he walked out the door, the deadbolt engaging behind him with a final, echoing snap. Room 114 at the Starlight Motel smelled of old nicotine and industrial bleach. It was a single-story concrete strip right off Route 9, a place where people didn't stay so much as they temporarily stopped existing. Logan dropped his canvas duffel bag onto the faded floral bedspread. The springs groaned in protest. He sat down heavily beside it, staring at the flicker of a neon vacancy sign bleeding through the thin, yellowed curtains. For the first time in 5 years, he was entirely alone. The silence here wasn't the heavy, pregnant quiet of his shared apartment. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a life that had been surgically removed. He checked his cheap digital watch. 4:30 p.m. Miles away, Catherine was likely unlocking the door to their apartment. When Catherine Whitmore turned her key in the deadbolt, her mind was preoccupied with the seating chart for a rehearsal dinner she had no business attending. She stepped into the narrow hallway, kicking off her damp designer heels, expecting the familiar, comforting smell of Logan's cooking or the low murmur of the television. Instead, she was met with an absolute, chilling stillness. "Logan?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly against the bare walls. She walked into the living room. The cushions on the sofa were perfectly aligned. The carpet showed the distinct, fresh tracks of a vacuum cleaner. It was too clean. A creeping sensation of unease began to crawl up the back of her neck. She moved toward the kitchen, her eyes scanning the immaculate countertops. That was when she saw it. Resting perfectly in the center of the kitchen island, catching the dim afternoon light, was a simple gold wedding band. Beside it lay his brass house key. Catherine froze. Her breath hitched in her throat, refusing to go down. She waited for a note. A sprawling letter of rage, a printed screenshot of an email, a shattered plate, anything to signal a human reaction. But there was nothing. She rushed to the bedroom, throwing open the closet doors. The faded canvas duffel bag was gone. His uniform shirts were gone. His heavy boots were missing from the mat. He hadn't just left. He had erased himself with terrifying precision. Panic, sharp and suffocating, seized her chest. She grabbed her phone, her real phone, the one with the cracked screen protector, and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. She dialed again. Nothing. Her carefully balanced dual existence suddenly felt like a tightrope snapping beneath her feet. Logan was her safety net, the quiet, steady foundation that allowed her to play her dangerous, high society games. Without his blind devotion to anchor her reality, she was entirely untethered. She stared at the gold ring on the counter, the silence of the room pressing against her eardrums until she felt dizzy. By the time the sun fully set, casting long, dark shadows over the New Jersey highway, Logan was tying his apron behind the counter of the diner. The rhythmic hiss of the grill was a welcome distraction from the agonizing knot in his stomach. Amanda Foster, balancing 3 heavy porcelain mugs on one arm, paused as she passed the prep station. She was a single mother working 2 jobs, a woman who knew the distinct look of a world falling apart. She studied Logan's pale face, the dark circles under his eyes, and the rigid, mechanical way he chopped onions. Her gaze briefly dropped to his left hand. The pale, indented ring of skin spoke volumes. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't ask intrusive questions. Instead, she quietly slid a fresh, steaming mug of black coffee next to his cutting board. "It's a long shift tonight, Hayes," Amanda said softly, her voice carrying the grounded, unpolished empathy of someone who had survived her own ruins. "Pace yourself." Logan stopped the knife. He looked at the coffee, then up at Amanda. For a fleeting second, the suffocating isolation cracked, just enough to let a breath of air in. He gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. He didn't have a plan, he didn't have a home, but as he picked up the mug, he realized he had survived the first day of the rest of his life. The fluorescent lighting of the luxury department store usually felt like a warm, validating spotlight to Catherine. Today, it felt like a harsh interrogation. She stood behind the gleaming glass of the cosmetics counter, mechanically arranging jars of anti-aging cream that cost more than a week's groceries. Her reflection in the mirrored display revealed dark, bruised shadows beneath her eyes, hastily covered by a thick layer of premium concealer. It had been 48 hours since she found the gold ring on the kitchen island. For 2 nights, she had returned to an apartment that felt less like a home and more like a perfectly preserved tomb. Every time she walked through the door, she braced herself for Logan's voice, for the smell of fried onions, for the heavy thud of his work boots. Instead, she was met with a ringing, suffocating silence that pressed against her eardrums. She couldn't report him missing. He had taken his clothes and his bag. He had left deliberately. And she knew, with a sickening, cold dread settling in her stomach, exactly why. Her cracked phone vibrated in her tailored pocket. She pulled it out, her heart hammering against her ribs, praying to see Logan's name. It was Julian. "Reservations at Les Bernardins tonight at 8. Wear the black silk dress, darling." Catherine stared at the screen, the breath catching in her throat. A wave of profound nausea washed over her. Just days ago, a text like this would have sent a thrill of victory through her veins, a confirmation that she was successfully ascending to a life of wealth and privilege. Now, the words felt like a tightening noose. She had built her entire glittering, fabricated life on the assumption that she could always retreat to the quiet, unglamorous safety of Logan's unconditional love. Without him, the high-wire act was terrifyingly unstable. She typed back a flawless, enthusiastic reply, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the phone onto the plush carpet. Across town, the early morning sun was just beginning to cut through the gray smog of New Jersey. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of old grease and fresh bleach. Logan sat in a back booth, his shift over, staring blankly at the steaming mug of black coffee between his calloused hands. Before he had left the apartment, in the agonizing hours before dawn, he had methodically forwarded the receipts, the lease agreement, and the wedding contracts from Catherine's rose gold device to a newly created, anonymous email address. He didn't know why he had done it at the time. It was an instinctual gathering of wreckage, a need to possess the concrete proof of his own destruction. Amanda slid into the vinyl booth across from him. She didn't ask if she could sit. She just brought her own mug and a plate of leftover toast, settling into the quiet space with the ease of someone who understood that words were often useless. They sat in silence for a long time, watching a garbage truck lumber past the rain-streaked window. "She's getting married," Logan said. His voice was terrifyingly flat, devoid of anger or tears. It was the sound of a man stating a simple, immutable fact of physics, like gravity or the freezing point of water. Amanda paused, halfway through a bite of toast. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer a dramatic expression of pity. She simply lowered the food back to the plate, her eyes fixed on his tired face. In her years of working double shifts and scraping by, she had seen every shade of human misery, but the absolute desolation in Logan's posture was a heavy thing to witness. "To you or to someone else?" she asked quietly. "Someone who buys her yachts and penthouses," Logan replied, his thumb tracing the rim of his ceramic mug. "Someone who doesn't smell like a deep fryer." Amanda leaned forward slightly, her forearms resting on the sticky table. "You're a good man, Hayes. A hard worker. Don't let someone else's sickness convince you that you're the disease." It was a small, unpolished offering of grace. Logan closed his eyes, the tight, agonizing knot in his chest loosening just a fraction of an inch. He wasn't healed. He wasn't even close to being okay. But sitting in the cheap diner booth, grounded by the quiet presence of a woman who didn't expect him to be anything other than broken, he realized he was going to survive the week. The public library off Route 9 was entirely quiet, smelling faintly of floor wax and decaying paper. Logan sat at a corner computer terminal, the harsh fluorescent light washing out his tired features. For 30 cents a page, the heavy commercial printer in the corner was methodically churning out the blueprints of his wife's betrayal. He gathered the warm sheets of paper with numb fingers. There were the high-resolution photos of Catherine and Julian on a chartered yacht, her hair blowing perfectly in the ocean breeze. There was the leasing agreement for the Tribeca penthouse, bearing her forged signature as a single woman. There were the catering receipts for an opulent wedding reception scheduled to happen while she was still legally tethered to a night shift line cook in New Jersey. Returning to room 114 of the Starlight Motel, Logan laid the documents out across the faded floral bedspread. The sheer volume and meticulous organization of the lies were staggering. This wasn't a fleeting, drunken mistake in a hotel bar. This was a highly calculated corporate merger where Catherine had positioned herself as the primary asset, slowly liquidating her marriage to him in the shadows. He reached into the bottom of his duffel bag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound folder he used to keep their tax returns and lease agreements. From the very back, he extracted a heavy piece of ivory paper, their marriage certificate. Logan ran his callous thumb over the raised seal of the municipal court. 5 years ago, they had stood in a cramped administrative office. She had worn a simple white sundress, and he had worn his only suit, a jacket that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He remembered the way she had looked at him then, her eyes shining with what he had sworn was an unshakable devotion. Now, staring at the official document under the flickering yellow bulb of a cheap motel lamp, he felt like he was holding a masterful forgery. He picked up a large brown manila envelope he had bought at a corner pharmacy on the walk back. Logan paused, his hand hovering over the scattered papers. A heavy, suffocating dilemma pressed down on his chest. If he had wanted a screaming match, he would have stayed in their apartment. He could have shattered their dishes, demanded apologies, and dragged her deception into the ugly, chaotic light of an argument. But he had chosen silence. Yet, leaving in silence wasn't enough. If he simply disappeared, Catherine would spin the narrative to her advantage. She would tell Julian that a deadbeat husband had finally abandoned her, painting herself as a resilient victim. With a hollow, aching clarity, Logan realized this act wasn't about revenge. It was about correcting the record. He wasn't acting out of rage. He was acting out of a profound, devastating grief. He was simply returning the truth to a woman who had tried to bury it. He slowly gathered the printed emails, the yacht photos, and the penthouse lease, sliding them into the brown envelope. Finally, he picked up the ivory marriage certificate, the undeniable, tangible proof that the refined, unencumbered woman Julian Vance was about to marry was an absolute fabrication. He slid it in last. Logan licked the adhesive strip, the taste of cheap glue, bitter and dry on his tongue, and pressed the flap firmly shut. He grabbed a black marker and carefully wrote out the name and corporate address he had found in the digital wedding contracts. Julian Vance, Vance Holdings LLC, Manhattan. He sat on the edge of the sagging mattress for a long time, the sealed envelope resting heavily on his knees. The rhythmic drip of the bathroom faucet was the only sound in the room. Tomorrow, he would buy a stamp. Tomorrow, he would drop the heavy weight of his broken marriage into a blue mailbox, effectively detonating a bomb in the center of Catherine's glittering new world. There would be no going back. Logan stood on the corner of 4th and Elm, the collar of his faded canvas jacket turned up against the biting New Jersey wind. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening a downpour that stubbornly refused to fall. Before him stood a standard blue postal box, its metal surface graffiti-scarred and slick with morning condensation. In his right hand, he held the thick manila envelope. It felt incredibly heavy for something made only of paper. Inside were the high-resolution yacht photos, the Tribeca lease agreement, the opulent wedding catering receipts, and the ivory municipal marriage certificate that legally bound Catherine Whitmore to a grease-stained line cook. He stared at the bold black ink spelling out Julian Vance's Manhattan corporate address. Logan felt no surge of triumph, no fiery rush of vindication. He felt only a hollow, cavernous ache expanding in the center of his chest. He was holding the distilled ashes of a 5-year devotion, neatly packaged for corporate delivery. He reached out, pulled down the squeaking metal handle of the mailbox, and slid the envelope into the dark slot. He let go. It made a soft, definitive thud as it hit the bottom. Logan stood there for a long moment, his rough hand still resting on the cold metal door. The silence of the gritty street was absolute. He had expected some profound shift in the universe, a sudden, dramatic lightening of the burden he carried. Instead, there was only the rumble of a passing delivery truck and the smell of exhaust fumes. He turned his back on the mailbox and began the long walk toward the diner, stepping forward as a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. 30 miles away, across the river, in a towering Manhattan department store, Catherine felt a sudden, inexplicable chill beneath the harsh, flattering lights of the cosmetics counter. She was carefully applying a sample of crushed pearl highlighter to the back of a wealthy client's hand, her smile fixed, practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth. "It gives the skin a flawless, untroubled finish," Catherine recited, her voice a mechanical hum. "I'll take 2, the client murmured, casually handing over a heavy platinum credit card. Catherine processed the transaction with trembling fingers. As soon as the woman turned away, Catherine ducked behind a towering geometric display of imported perfumes and pulled out her old, cracked phone. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs, the sound rushing in her ears. 0 new messages, 0 missed calls. It had been 4 days since Logan vanished, 4 days of returning to an immaculate, suffocatingly silent apartment. The sheer, absolute absence of him was slowly eroding her sanity. If he had screamed, if he had shattered the living room windows or destroyed her expensive trench coat, she would have known exactly how to handle it. She could have negotiated with anger, she could have played the victim to his rage, but she could not negotiate with complete erasure. Her pristine rose gold phone vibrated in her tailored pocket. She flinched, slowly pulling it out to see a text from Julian. "Julian, the board members are eager to meet the future Mrs. Vance tonight. Wear the sapphire earrings, darling. Dinner at 7. Catherine squeezed her eyes shut, leaning heavily against the cool glass of the display case. The heavily perfumed air in the store suddenly felt too thick to breathe. She was standing on the very precipice of everything she had ever desired: limitless wealth, untouchable status, a penthouse in the sky, yet she felt as though she were in a terrifying, uncontrolled freefall. The entire foundation of her glittering reality had been built on the quiet, unshakable certainty that Logan would always be waiting in the dark, a safety net she could blindly rely on while she reached for the stars. Without his tether, the sapphire earrings and the corporate dinners felt like heavy stones tied to her ankles. She looked at her reflection in the mirrored counter. The premium anti-aging concealer could no longer hide the stark, terrified hollowness in her eyes. She was flawlessly dressed, perfectly poised, and entirely aware that the silence closing in around her was just the quiet before the execution. The private elevator to the Tribeca penthouse ascended with a smooth, silent hum, though Catherine's stomach felt as if it were plummeting toward the earth. She had changed into the required black silk dress in the department store restroom, fastening the heavy sapphire earrings with fingers that refused to stop trembling. The suffocating dread she had carried since finding Logan's wedding ring remained a cold, hard knot beneath her ribs, but she forced a radiant, untroubled smile onto her face as the polished metal doors parted. The penthouse was submerged in the deep, violet twilight of the city. The panoramic windows framed a glittering Manhattan skyline, a vast empire of glass and wealth she was desperately trying to claim. But the apartment was unnervingly quiet. Julian was not wearing the bespoke tuxedo she expected for the board dinner. He stood in his tailored gray day suit by the sprawling marble kitchen island, an amber glass of scotch loosely gripped in his hand. The warm, commanding affection he usually reserved for her was entirely absent. He looked at her not as a lover, but as a severe liability. Catherine stepped off the elevator, the click of her heels sounding like gunshots in the cavernous room. "Julian? I thought we were leaving for Les Bernardins." Julian did not move. He simply lowered his gaze to the surface of the kitchen island. Illuminated by a single, harsh pendant light were several pieces of paper, arranged with the clinical, merciless precision of a corporate audit. Beside them rested a crumpled, brown manila envelope. "My assistant screens the mail at the executive office," Julian said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the fiery passion or raging betrayal Catherine might have known how to manipulate. "She brought this directly to my desk at 3 o'clock. Catherine approached the marble counter, the air in the room suddenly turning to lead in her lungs. She looked down. There were the high-resolution yacht photos. There was the catering contract for their wedding. And resting dead center, pristine and undeniable, was the heavy ivory paper bearing the raised seal of a New Jersey municipal court, a marriage certificate. Valid, legally binding, and carrying her signature right next to Logan Hayes. A sharp, ringing noise filled Catherine's ears. The floor beneath her designer heels seemed to dissolve. She reached out to grip the edge of the cold marble, her knuckles turning white as she stared at the distilled ashes of her double life. Logan had not simply walked away in defeat. He had silently packed the explosives, laid the fuse, and walked out the door right before the blast. "Julian, I can explain," she choked out, the words tasting like ash. It was a pathetic, hollow reflex. There was no explanation that could erase the raised seal of a government document. "Explain what?" Julian asked, taking a slow sip of his scotch. He looked at her with a chilling, detached disgust. "That the refined, unattached woman I introduced to my investors is legally bound to a short-order cook? That my fiancé is a liability who forged a leasing agreement on my property? I loved you," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her premium concealer, hot and stinging. "I was going to file the papers. I was ending it." "You are a fraud, Catherine," Julian replied smoothly, setting his glass down. There was no heartbreak in his eyes, only the cold calculation of a man cutting his losses on a bad investment. "The board requires absolute transparency, and you are a walking public relations disaster. My security team is waiting in the lobby. You have 10 minutes to collect whatever you left in the guest room and exit the building." He didn't wait for her to scream or beg. Julian simply turned his back and walked toward his private study, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him with absolute, terrifying finality. Catherine stood alone in the dim light of the penthouse, the sapphire earrings suddenly feeling like heavy, crushing weights pulling her down into the wreckage of her own making. The bell above the diner's glass door chimed violently, shattering the low, ambient hum of the 2 a.m. shift. Outside, a sudden coastal storm had broken over New Jersey, lashing the asphalt with heavy sheets of rain. When Catherine pushed through the entrance, she brought the storm inside with her. She was a jarring, chaotic sight against the backdrop of faded vinyl booths and sticky formica. The bespoke black silk dress she had worn to the Tribeca penthouse was soaked, clinging to her shivering frame. The heavy sapphire earrings dangled from her earlobes like mocking remnants of a dead empire. Her meticulously styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face, and her premium makeup had melted into dark, bruised streaks beneath her eyes. She looked nothing like the refined, unattached woman who had captivated a billionaire, and nothing like the devoted wife who used to greet Logan at the door. She was simply a woman who had lost everything. Behind the counter, Logan was scraping the flat-top grill. At the sound of the bell, he paused, the metal spatula hovering over the sizzling grease. He lifted his head. Their eyes met across the narrow aisle. Catherine's breath hitched in her throat. She gripped the edge of a swivel stool, bracing herself for the explosion. She wanted him to yell. She needed him to hurl plates, to curse her name, to demand to know how she could have lived a double life for months. Anger, she could negotiate with. Rage meant he still cared, that there was still blood pumping through the corpse of their marriage. But Logan did not yell. His expression remained entirely unchanged. His eyes, which had once looked at her with a blind, unwavering devotion, were terrifyingly empty. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before lowering his head and returning to the grill. The rhythmic, scraping sound of metal against metal resumed, steady and indifferent. "Logan!" Catherine gasped, stumbling forward until her wet thighs hit the counter. The smell of fried onions and old coffee, a scent she had spent months trying to scrub from her skin, suddenly felt like the only thing keeping her upright. "Logan, please." He did not look up. He wiped down the stainless steel ledge with a damp rag, moving with the methodical precision of a man completely alone in the room. "You ruined it," she choked out, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of tears spilled over her cheeks. "You sent it to him. You destroyed everything I built. Did you think that would fix this? Did you think leaving me with nothing would bring you peace?" Silence. The hiss of the grill was his only answer. Catherine slammed her manicured hand flat against the counter, the sharp slap echoing in the near-empty diner. "Look at me. Scream at me, Logan. Tell me you hate me. Do something." "Miss." The voice did not belong to Logan. It came from the end of the counter. Amanda Foster stepped out from the swinging doors of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a heavily stained apron. She didn't raise her voice, but there was a grounded, unyielding authority in her posture that commanded the space. She walked slowly toward Catherine, placing herself squarely between the weeping woman and the grill station. Catherine glared at the waitress, her upper lip curling in a desperate, defensive sneer. "Stay out of this. This is between me and my husband." "He's not your husband anymore," Amanda said quietly. Her eyes dropped briefly to Catherine's left hand, bare and trembling, before meeting her tear-streaked face. "And this is a place of business. You're dripping rainwater all over my clean floor, and you're harassing my line cook." "You don't understand what he did to me," Catherine sobbed, her manicured fingers curling into fists. "I understand that you need to leave," Amanda replied, her tone completely devoid of pity or intimidation. It was the calm voice of a woman dealing with a broken machine. "Walk out the door, miss, or I will call the police and have you trespassed." Catherine stared at the waitress, then looked past her shoulder. Logan was plating a stack of hash browns, his back turned to her. The absolute, impenetrable nature of his indifference was a physical blow, heavier than any insult he could have spoken. He hadn't just walked away from her, he had ceased to perceive her altogether. Stripped of her wealth, her illusions, and the safety net she had taken for granted, Catherine slowly backed away from the counter. She turned and walked out into the freezing rain, the diner door clicking shut behind her, leaving her entirely in the dark. The radiator in the corner of the studio apartment hissed, spitting a metallic, hollow sound into the cramped room. It was located in a grim, forgotten pocket of Queens, a far cry from the glittering skyline of Tribeca, and even further from the quiet, modest comfort of the New Jersey apartment she had once called home. The single window looked out onto a stained brick wall, blocking the afternoon sun and trapping the room in a perpetual muddy twilight. Catherine sat on the edge of a bare twin mattress, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor. The only items she had managed to salvage from Julian's penthouse before the security detail escorted her out were packed into 2 large designer suitcases. The premium leather bags looked absurdly out of place, resting against the peeling floral wallpaper, relics of a kingdom she had been permanently exiled from. She reached into one of the unzipped bags and pulled out a heavy jar of imported night cream, the frosted glass cool against her palm. It retailed for more than her security deposit on this miserable room. A bitter, jagged laugh escaped her throat, echoing off the thin walls. She was a cosmetics manager who had spent years selling the illusion of youth, vitality, and flawless perfection. Now, she sat surrounded by her luxury products, completely bankrupt in every way that mattered. The silence in the studio was profoundly different from the silence in the New Jersey apartment the day she found Logan's ring. That silence had been expectant, a tense void she thought she could eventually negotiate with. This silence was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating sound of a dead end. She picked up her cracked phone. Her thumb hovered over the contacts list. Julian had blocked her number across all platforms. Her newly acquired high society friends, the women she had painstakingly courted over $300 lunches, had evaporated the moment rumors of the broken engagement circulated. And Logan was a ghost, standing behind a diner counter, protected by a waitress who saw right through her, entirely untouchable. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, gray shadows across the small room, the true architecture of her husband's retaliation finally became clear to her. He hadn't hired a vicious divorce attorney to drag her through a chaotic public court battle. He hadn't plastered her face across social media to shame her, nor had he demanded a dramatic confrontation to feed his own ego. He hadn't even raised his voice. Logan had simply gathered the truth, the unvarnished, undeniable truth she had worked so meticulously to bury, and handed it to the man she was lying to. Catherine pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around her legs as the damp chill of the poorly insulated room seeped into her bones. The realization was heavier than any physical blow. Logan hadn't destroyed her. He had simply stopped protecting her from herself. He had removed his quiet, unwavering devotion, the very foundation that had allowed her to safely play her dangerous, high-stakes games in the dark, and simply stepped aside to watch the house of cards collapse. She looked at the small, clouded mirror hanging crookedly above a rusted sink. The woman staring back at her was stripped of her expensive wardrobe and her manufactured grace. There was no wealthy fiancé to impress, and no devoted, blue-collar husband to blindly catch her when she fell. There was only Catherine, sitting alone in the cold, finally suffocating under the crushing weight of her own ambition. Winter settled over New Jersey with a biting, relentless cold, frosting the edges of the diner's expansive front windows. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting, heavy scent of roasted coffee beans and maple syrup. The holiday rush had finally died down, leaving the late-night shift in a state of quiet, rhythmic predictability. Logan stood behind the stainless steel counter, expertly flipping a row of hash browns. His movements were fluid, muscle memory taking over, while his mind floated in a rare, untroubled calm. It had been nearly 3 months since he dropped the manila envelope into the blue postal box on 4th and Elm. 3 months since he had effectively excised Catherine from his existence. He had moved out of the Starlight Motel weeks ago, renting a small, one-bedroom walk-up above a hardware store. It was drafty, and the floorboards creaked, but it was entirely his own. There were no expensive French moisturizers cluttering the bathroom sink, no designer coats draped over the chairs, and, most importantly, no ghosts of a fabricated life lingering in the shadows. The suffocating, cavernous ache in his chest, the one that used to steal his breath in the middle of the night, had gradually solidified into a dull, quiet scar. He still felt it when the weather turned cold, but it no longer paralyzed him. The bell above the door remained silent. At 3:15 a.m., the diner belonged only to him and Amanda. Amanda walked behind the counter, carrying a heavy stack of porcelain plates. She bumped her hip lightly against his to maneuver past the narrow grill station, a casual, familiar contact that Logan would have flinched at months ago. Now, he simply stepped back, anticipating her rhythm. "Slow night," Amanda murmured, sliding the plates onto the lower shelf with a soft clatter. "No complaints here," Logan replied, using the edge of his spatula to scrape the grill down. When the final booth was wiped down and the neon open sign buzzed off, casting the front half of the diner into shadows, Amanda poured 2 mugs of black coffee. She didn't ask. It had become their unspoken ritual. They sat in the back booth, the vinyl cold against Logan's shoulders. Outside, a light snow began to fall, swirling under the amber glow of the street lamps. Logan wrapped his calloused hands around the warm ceramic. He looked across the table at Amanda. She looked tired, the faint lines around her eyes deepening after a 12-hour shift, her hair pulled back in a messy clip. There was no pretense with her, no curated high society illusions, no exhausting dual narratives to maintain. She was exactly who she presented herself to be, a woman working hard to keep the lights on for her kid, surviving the rough edges of the world with a quiet, stubborn grace. "You look different, Hayes," Amanda said softly, taking a sip of her coffee. She rested her chin on her hand, studying him in the dim light. Logan traced the rim of his mug. "Different how?" "Lighter?" she noted, her voice carrying a gentle certainty. "When you first started taking the extra shifts, you walked around like you were dragging a safe chain to your ankle. You don't look like you're drowning anymore." Logan looked out the window at the falling snow. For a long time, he had believed that his worth was tethered to his ability to provide a foundation for Catherine's dreams, no matter how much it cost him. Sitting here in the quiet diner, sharing a cheap cup of coffee with a woman who asked nothing of him but his honest company, he realized the safe had finally unlatched. "I think I finally hit the bottom," Logan said, his voice steady and calm in the silent room. "And I realized I could just stand up." Amanda smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that reached her eyes. She clinked her heavy mug gently against his. The sharp, metallic clack echoed softly in the empty diner, ringing out not as an ending, but as the quiet, definitive sound of a new beginning. By late November, the coastal storms off the New Jersey shoreline brought a bitter, driving rain that turned the city streets into slick ribbons of black glass. Inside the diner, the air was a thick, comforting insulation of roasted coffee, melted butter, and the low, steady hum of the industrial heating vent. Logan stood near the front register, a towel draped over his shoulder, quietly tallying a stack of delivery receipts. He had recently been promoted to the day shift, a small, seemingly insignificant change that had fundamentally altered the rhythm of his life. He was no longer a ghost haunting the deep hours of the night. He saw the sun. He slept when the rest of the world slept. He paused his calculations, lifting his head to watch the rain lash against the expansive front window. Across the street, the flickering street lamp illuminated a cracked plastic bus shelter. A lone figure was huddled beneath it, shrinking away from the freezing spray of passing cars. Logan's gaze drifted over the woman purely out of a passive, idle sympathy, but his eyes suddenly caught and locked. It was Catherine. She was unrecognizable from the woman who had once navigated the gleaming aisles of luxury department stores in tailored trench coats and heavy sapphire earrings. She was wearing a cheap, shapeless, bright blue polyester windbreaker, the unmistakable uniform of a discount pharmacy chain. Her hair, once meticulously styled to project an air of effortless high society grace, hung in limp, damp strands around her face. She looked bone-tired, carrying the heavy, sagging posture of a woman who had spent 10 hours standing on her feet with absolutely nothing to return home to. For a suspended moment, the ambient noise of the diner faded into a dull ringing in Logan's ears. He stood perfectly still, watching her shivering in the cold. Months ago, the mere sight of her would have triggered a catastrophic physical reaction, a blinding rush of agony, a desperate urge to run out into the storm and drape his own coat over her shoulders, to save her from the consequences of her own actions. He waited for that familiar twisting pain to rise in his chest. It never came. Instead, a profound, startling stillness settled over him. He felt the same distant, removed pity he would feel for any stranger caught in a downpour. The woman across the street was no longer his wife. She was no longer the architect of his suffering, nor the center of his universe. She was simply a consequence of her own devastating ambition, living in the wreckage she had chosen over his devotion. As if sensing the weight of his gaze, Catherine slowly turned her head. Across the 4 lanes of rain-slicked asphalt, through the condensation of the diner window and the buzzing neon of the open sign, her eyes met his. Even from a distance, Logan could see the immediate, visceral shock register on her face. She saw him standing in the warm, golden light of the diner. She saw the quiet, steady strength in his posture, a man who had survived the absolute destruction of his world and rebuilt it with his bare hands. Just then, Amanda walked up to the front counter. She bumped her shoulder casually against Logan's, holding out a fresh, steaming mug of black coffee. She followed his line of sight out the window, pausing for a fraction of a second as she recognized the woman in the rain. Amanda didn't say a word. She simply set the mug down next to Logan's hand, offering a quiet, grounded presence that asked for nothing and hid nothing. Catherine witnessed the exchange. Through the freezing rain, she saw the simple, honest warmth of a life she had deemed unworthy, a life she had thrown away in pursuit of a glittering illusion that had left her with absolutely nothing. Her shoulders dropped, a final, crushing defeat settling over her shivering frame. She did not raise her hand. She did not try to cross the street. She simply stood in the cold, staring at the warmth she could no longer touch. Logan looked at her for one final long second. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement not of greeting, but of absolute closure. Then, He turned his back to the window. He picked up the warm ceramic mug, the heat seeping comfortably into his calloused palms. He took a sip, the bitter, rich taste grounding him in the present moment. The bell above the door chimed as a customer walked in, shaking off an umbrella. Logan smiled, a genuine, untroubled expression, and stepped forward to greet them, leaving the ghosts of his past out in the rain where they belonged.